Okay, so we should be recording now. Hi, so this is just my my class. So this week we've done Pascal's wager, and I'll be speaking with Liz Jackson, who has written a permissivist defense of Pascal's wager, which was, it's forthcoming, isn't it? It's forthcoming in her Kentness. It hasn't yet been. You can read it online. The students might not realize you can read unpublished, like forthcoming papers online, but you can. So you can read it online, but it's yet to be published. So this is like cutting edge Pascal's wager research.
Yeah, it's not come out yet. So
yeah. This is what we like to see. So just before we start, as I ask everyone who I interview, I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into philosophy. How did you end up being a published Pascal Wagerian?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I guess just briefly about me, I also teach philosophy. I teach at Ryerson University, which is a school in Toronto. I've now taught there for a full year, so I'm starting on my second year now. So that's a little bit about who I am. How did I get into philosophy? It's a great question. So I remember, as an undergraduate in university, trying to figure out what I wanted to major in. I don't know if in the UK, I think a lot of people come in with a major, but in the US, you usually have a couple years. A lot of people don't even declare until their second or third year. And so I was taking different classes, trying to figure out I was going to be a math major. And then I was like, maybe I should try political science. I was bumping around quite a bit. And then I remember thinking, maybe I should just try a philosophy class, just kind of see how it goes. And so I took a class. It was called Social and Political Philosophy. And I was like hooked. I was like, oh my goodness, this is what I've been interested in and thinking about. And, I was always that kid that had tons of questions, what's the smallest thing ever possible? Or if there's a God, who created God? Every question I had it, And so I took this class and I was like, this is amazing. I felt super at home. And it was a no question for me to declare a philosophy major after that class. So I really enjoyed philosophy. I really loved it. And then I think I was considering grad school, but not sure about it. And ended up figuring out that often a PhD program, you get funding if you can get in. And so I said, I'm just going to try to apply, see if I can get funding. And then if not, I'll maybe go do something else. And I did actually end up getting into a PhD program with funding. I went to Notre Dame for my PhD. And in retrospect, I made that decision not being fully informed about how terrible the job market is. It's really bad. If any of you are interested in PhD programs, I would probably tell you a little bit more about that before you made your decision. But I knew it was bad, but I didn't know how bad. I ended up getting a job, which is, I'm super blessed, super lucky that I did. But yeah, so that's kind of me and how I got into philosophy.
Excellent, awesome. Yeah. So is it just philosophy of religion that you do? What are your research interests?
I mainly do basically two things: epistemology and then philosophy of religion. So I'm interested in questions like, what should we believe? Actually, a lot of that comes up in this paper. And then I also think about credences. They're kind of like subjective probabilities or confidence levels. How does that interact with belief? And then, some other stuff in epistemology, some of it we'll talk about today. And then, yes, philosophy of religion. The big question I'm interested in there is sort of what makes a religious commitment rational? When is a religious commitment rational? When is it not? And so that comes up both in questions about the rationality of faith, and then also the topic of today, which is Pascal's wager.
Excellent, awesome. So turning to the paper itself. So you, maybe I should let you tell us a bit about, what, in a nutshell, what the paper argues before we get stuck in.
Yeah. So Pascal's wager is this argument. It's not an argument that says God exists. A lot of the traditional arguments they try to give evidence that God exists. Pascal's wager is different than these, the ontological or the cosmological argument. If you know what those are, it's different because it concludes you should believe in God. And it basically concludes you should believe in God because of this kind of cost benefit analysis is one way you can think about it. And it says, look, if you believe in God and God exists, that could be infinitely good. You get to have a relationship with God. You go to heaven. If you believe in God and God, if you don't believe in God and God exists, I mean, we can debate about that. Some religious people think there's a hell. Some people believe in annihilationism, which means you cease to exist. But either way, there's a chance that it's significantly worse than when you believe in God and God exists. And then if God doesn't exist, whether you believe in God or not, it's kind of negligible. Like, maybe we can talk about whether it'd be slightly better. I guess if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, you have a false belief, so we can talk about these gains and losses, but either way, the thought is they're going to be finite. And so when you look at this cost benefit analysis, you have a lot to gain by believing in God and very little to lose by believing in God. So that's the thought, kind of the basic version of the wager. And I guess I'll say most people defending the wager probably think it has to end up being more complicated than that, but that's sort of the most basic form of the argument. So anyway, that as the background, there's two big objections to the wager, not the only two objections, but two of the big ones. The first is what I call the impossibility objection. It says it's impossible to take Pascal's wager because you can't just control your beliefs at will. If I give you £1,000 to believe 1 + 1 = 3, you can't do it. So we can't take Pascal's wager. And so it's just, the argument fails because it's telling you to do something impossible. The second is what I call the irrationality objection. And that says, well, look, even if you could take the wager, if you could find a way to control your belief, that would be irrational. Because let's say I did give you money to believe 1 + 1 = 3, and maybe you could take a pill that would change your belief. That belief isn't rational because it's based on this benefit. It's not based on the evidence. You need to follow the evidence where it leads. So basically, what I try to do is say, look, if this particular theory in epistemology, we can talk more about it, it's called epistemic permissivism. If that theory is true, then we have really good responses to both the impossibility objection and the irrationality objection.
Oh, excellent. So hopefully my students are watching this interview going, yes, I know of these things, because they should have heard about the first objection. They should have heard about the first objection in our lectures. We talk about doxastic voluntarism, which I know you talk about in the paper. Where you don't have control over your beliefs, and they have this again addressed to the students watching this video. You should bear in mind that second objection connects to some of the issues we discussed in the first lecture about presumptions and evidentialism. So you're defending the wager on against these objections, and you're doing it on down to permissivism. Would you mind telling us a bit about what permissivism is and what intrapersonal permissivism ends up being?
Yeah, definitely. So this is kind of the big concept that I think to get the paper, you really got to get this concept. So epistemic permissivism is the view that sometimes a body of evidence permits more than one rational belief attitude. Let me just say what that means really quick. Most epistemologists think that when it comes to belief, for every statement, you can believe it, you can withhold belief on it, or you can disbelieve it. So, I believe 1 + 1 = 2. I withhold belief that I have an even number of hairs on my head. And I disbelieve that it's raining right now. I can look outside and it's sunny, right? So we have these three attitudes. And so then permissivism says sometimes hold some evidence fixed. More than one of those can be rational. And you can make that claim in terms of two people. Like you could imagine two jurors who sit on the same jury, and then they hear all the same evidence about whether Smith is guilty. One believes Smith is innocent, the other believes Smith is guilty. The idea behind permissivism would say, both of those jurors could be rational, even though they have the same evidence. And then you can, so that's about two agents or more. You could also make it about a single agent. That's the version I'm interested in. And so the idea is that maybe I'm a juror sitting on this, in this courtroom trying to decide if Smith is guilty. I hear all the evidence. It's really ambiguous. There's good evidence that he's guilty, good evidence that he's innocent. Maybe, there's evidence on both sides, and maybe the evidence is really complicated. And the idea is that I could be rational as a single person to believe he's guilty or believe he's innocent. And so the idea is that the evidence doesn't always force a rational attitude on you. Sometimes you can take more than one rational response to your evidence.
Oh, cool. Is it too big a question to sort of ask if someone doubted that, if someone thought that there's always like a rational decision to be reached in every legal case? Is there anything we could say to such people who kind of like shoot down their worries, or is that too big a question?
No, that's a great question. And in the paper, just because there's so many moving parts already, I don't say a ton about this, but I do think there's some, I think, compelling reasons to think this is true. So I think one reason to think this is true is just because evidence can be really complicated. It can be difficult to assess. And I think it's going to be asking a lot, especially when you think about these really big controversial topics, to say that everyone aware of the relevant evidence has to take the same position. So you can even think about the case of God, and this is especially relevant to the paper. I think there's a lot of people that they know about all the same arguments for God's existence and the same arguments against God's existence. They know about, the relevant, all this relevant data, right, that bears on the question whether God exists. And some are theists and some are atheists and some are agnostics, right? And I think it would be, it sounds too strong and too strict to me to say that one of them has to be irrational. As long as they're aware of the same evidence, I think there's just good evidence on both sides. It can be difficult to evaluate. Some theists are rational, some atheists are rational, and some agnostics are rational. And I think this doesn't apply to everything. So that's a really important thing to say too. Most of us, given our evidence, we should believe 1 + 1 = 2, right? That's not a permissive case. The permissivist just says there are some bodies of evidence like this. So it's not a claim about all evidence. It's just saying some of these super controversial issues, it seems it's too strict to say you're being irrational if you take a certain position, because these are just really tough topics. Evidence is hard to evaluate and ambiguous, and there's multiple good explanations of the evidence. So that's brief. There's a lot more you could say there. If you look at the paper, I think I cite like 5 different papers that give a more extended defense of this, but that's at least some of the reason you might think this is true.
Excellent. Hopefully our students can follow up those sentences if they're interested in that angle. Okay, so let's imagine permissivism is true. How does it, in your paper, what do you say about how you deal with the first of those objections, the one that says that I haven't got like voluntary control over what I believe. I'm just kind of stuck with my beliefs, and so it makes no sense to say that I could just choose them like Pascal wants me to.
Yeah, good. So the impossibility objection, basically, again, like you said, says we can't control what we believe. Beliefs are sort of forced on us. And I think, look, that is probably true in certain cases, right? It's very difficult, if not impossible, to try to make yourself believe 1 + 1 = 3. But the problem is that when people, especially when they use these cases to support doxastic involuntarism, the view that we can't control our beliefs, when they use these cases, they're considering cases where the evidence just clearly supports one thing, right? They don't consider cases where you're really torn about what to believe and you really think the evidence could go either way. And one way to understand these cases is you're in a permissive case, and you might, at least on some level, be aware of that. And you could say, like, think about maybe some political issue you're really torn about. I think one example I gave, I think this is much more of a political issue in the US, but people feel torn about gun control. Like how much should the government be involved or regulate what guns people can own? That's probably not the best example for like UK, Canada stuff, but in the US, it's very controversial.
Yeah.
So you might, but you get the idea. Yeah. So you might be really torn about that. And you might really just be like, oh, should they regulate this? I don't know. And you're kind of going back and forth. And I think in those cases, it's way less obvious that the evidence just forces this belief on you so that you have no choice in the matter. I think in those cases, it's you can exercise much more agency over what you believe. And, I kind of leave it open in the paper what exactly this looks like, whether that's like similar to hand raising, where you can just believe something in one kind of easy, quick action. But I also talk about this idea that maybe you can kind of focus on the evidence in certain ways or deliberate in certain ways that makes it more likely you'll come to a certain conclusion. And maybe just really briefly, I know I don't want to go too long, but I have this case that I think is really interesting. This philosopher named Peter Van Inwagen, and he teaches at Notre Dame. And he talks about when he was actually converting to theism, how he could see the world in this duck rabbit fashion. So some of you might have seen this optical illusion where you can see it as a duck and see it as a rabbit, and you can actually kind of move back and forth, like seeing it in both ways. If you've ever seen it, if you haven't, Google it because it's kind of cool. And he's like, actually, that's kind of how I was with respect to viewing the world. And then is there a God or not? And he's like, I could see the world as just by itself. There's no God. And then I could kind of move and see it as if there is a God. And he says, in the same duck rabbit way, I would move back and forth. And I think that's a really good example of permissivism, where he says, I can move back and forth at will. I can see the world in both ways. And I think his evidence isn't forcing one perspective on him. He's kind of seeing the evidence on both sides. And he interestingly describes this a lot more like a choice. And so I think if you're in a permissive case, I think you have a lot more control over what you believe. And so the impossibility objection doesn't go through.
Okay, so this would be a Pascal's wager, not aimed at anyone, like your Richard Dawkins style atheist. Just going to go, well, look, this doesn't help me. This doesn't help me because they don't see it as being like permissive. They think the evidence is in and there's no God. But you're thinking that there's nevertheless lots of people who will be in this kind of epistemic situation.
Yeah, and we kind of skipped over a little bit in the beginning of the paper. So in actually the second section, I try to give an argument, not that everyone is in this situation with respect to theism, but that quite a few people are. And so I talk about, in the divine hiddenness. This is a big literature in philosophy of religion. There's a lot of talk about why our evidence for theism is really ambiguous. I talk about how, how long these debates have been going on. There's good evidence. It seems like there is good evidence on both sides. And then there's arguments for God, arguments against God. And then those have been reformulated and objected to. And it's just, it's been going on since the beginning of philosophy, really. And so I try to argue that, even if there might be people that it's just so obvious to them God exists. There might be people like Richard Dawkins, it's so obvious to them God doesn't exist. But I try to argue that a lot of people are actually in this middle camp where either one could be rational for them. And then especially if they kind of put themselves in a place where they start considering the other side as a live possibility. And I don't think that's changing your evidence. I think that's just kind of changing your perspective on the evidence. So I do try to argue for that in the paper.
Awesome.
But that's a good point.
So there's just that last bit then on the last objection. So this second objection, that it's somehow irrational for me to just wake up one morning caught between two ways, and rather than waiting for some more evidence going, I'll go for God existing. Mm-hmm. So how does permissivism take care of that? How is this analogy with the jaw that's taking care of that?
Yeah, so I think, we started off when we were talking about this irrationality objection, me giving you money to believe 1 + 1 = 3, right? And I think almost all of us, all philosophers would agree, there is something irrational about that. And that's because clearly your evidence supports that 1 + 1 = 3, that's false, right? But I think it's very different if you're in a situation where the evidence leaves it open what you can rationally believe. And so you could take a case where, and I give some cases like this in the paper, there's multiple responses to the evidence that are all equally supported by the evidence and all equally rational for you. In some sense, by definition, taking one of those attitudes is rational because we've kind of stipulated that you're in a case where you're in a permissive case. You're in a case where there's multiple rational responses to the evidence. Again, this would have to be a case where, in order to take Pascal's wager, believing God exists, like we were kind of just talking about, that would need to be one of the rational responses, but that's kind of by definition rational. And then I also consider this idea, well, what if you're motivated by a practical reason? Isn't there something kind of weird about that, even though it's in some sense supported by your evidence? And so then I try to argue, well, there's at least, so one, I think, is being motivated by a practical reason better than just choosing at random? That's not really clear. But even then, I think there's some really important senses in which the belief is rational, even if it's motivated by a practical reason. Let me give one quick case for this. Yeah. So you, let's say you meet a new colleague at your work. And then, you don't really get to know them very well, but you try to wave at them in the hallway one time and they don't pay attention to you. And then maybe they seem a little quiet and not super friendly.
You do that to me all the time.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Relatable case. Yeah. And so you kind of reflect on this one day and you realize, I've come to believe that they're a bad person. And I've come to believe they're unfriendly and rude. But then you're like, I don't really have to believe this given my evidence. Maybe I have some evidence for this, but it's pretty weak. And I could be rational to believe that they're a good person, or to even withhold belief and not take a stand either way. And if they are a good person, I have a lot to gain by this. I could gain a new friend or at least a friendly colleague. So there's not much point in me believing they're a bad person, even if that's rational from my evidence. And I think in this case, I don't see anything objectionable about at all about you either withholding belief or even, trying to believe they're a good person, at least until you get decisive evidence that they're not. And I actually think this kind of thing is common all the time. So I think the force of evidentialism, this idea we have to follow the evidence, really comes in when we are engaging in a kind of wishful thinking that makes us totally ignore what our evidence supports. But when our evidence is ambiguous, I actually think you can be rational to not only believe something else, but believe it for a practical reason. So that's sort of the cliff notes. There's a lot more details in the paper about this that you should go check out. So.
Yeah, certainly the students had the link to the paper, and that's excellent. I think that's a really nice insight into Pascal's wager, and thanks for telling us all about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this has been excellent. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.